Is everybody silent?
Mute.
Yeah, that says mute.
No, if you
Unmute it, and it's not going to.
Good afternoon. David Hicks MacPherson was my emeritus minister. How lucky was I? I want to welcome all of you to this memorial service in honor of the Reverend David Hicks MacPherson, emeritus minister of the First Unitarian Universalist Church. I'm so glad all of you with us. It's a tribute to David that you would come and recall the magnificent man that he was, and to be here for this family. We're so glad that you've decided to join us today. And today, we'll be bringing forward memories, recollections, some of which David told us must be in the memorial service. A man so passionate and so devoted to his faith, he will oblige. It is the custom in the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Richmond to sound the bells of the church one time for each decade that the person has lived. And David, being 92, gets 10 soundings of the bell. We'll now hear those soundings in honor as we begin our service in memorial of David, Reverend Dave.
I'm not hearing anything. Looks like somebody's speaking.
Good afternoon, all. For those that do not know me well, my name is Erin MacPherson, and I am a seventh-generation Unitarian Universalist, and I have the honor of calling the Reverend David Hicks MacPherson my grandfather. When asked to select a chalice lighting for this memorial service, I knew I had to find a reading that set the tone for the service, as well as truly capturing the essence of my grandfather. I knew that finding the perfect words would be a daunting task, but the right words found me, and came from a familiar source, Gordon Bucky McKeeman. Bucky was a great friend of my grandfather's. In both their personal and professional lives, these two men loudly proclaimed universalism and were beloved by their families and congregations. Within these words by my grandfather's beloved friend, Bucky McKeeman, I hear my grandfather's voice, charging us to continue to bring light into the darkness and spread the beauty of Unitarian Universalism to the world. Let There Be Light by Gordon Bucky McKeeman. Let there be light. Let it shine in dark places, in moments of pain, in times of grief, and the darkness of hatred, violence, oppression, where there is discouragement and despair. Wherever darkness is put to flight, let there be light.
Hello, everyone, and blessings as we come together to celebrate Reverend Dave's life. The tune we just heard, the Hussite Freedom Song, was one of Reverend Dave's favorite tunes. He had Margaret Stokely transcribe it from a phonograph. He asked me to play it on countless occasions, as it held personal meaning to him in both his studies of history and religion. See, the song arose in the 15th century in what we now call the Czech Republic, as the Hussites rose to fight a religious civil war, wanting the right to practice their view of Protestantism against the dictations of Catholicism. A war that began when peaceful protesters marched in the streets of their hometown, only to be met by stones thrown at them and lives lost. Reverend Dave loved talking about the war, and he loved talking about all of history, and he loved talking about freedom, a concept he believed we should all fight for. The song was also featured in an early 20th century movie, starred by Paul Robeson, telling the story of an African-American man brought into Western white culture as a famed opera singer, only to feel alienated by his African lineage in a sea of white fans. A role that Robeson spoke of as honestly portraying his experience as a Black man in a white world. The story concludes as he finds out that he's the ancestor of kings, and he returns to his people in a position of royalty, where he combines Western technology with African love and tradition. While reviewed at the time as being sentimental and absurd, I believe Reverend Dave held an emotional attachment to the movie and the song, seeing it as support of his dream of realizing heaven on earth for an entire global human family, a dream he inspired me to believe, and giving me the tools not just to metaphorically, but literally lift Black voices as they are, without my Western influence, to listen to them and allow them the regality that was stolen from them by mine own ancestors. That massive Black Lives Matter pin that he wore everywhere, it wasn't just a decoration to him. It was a call to action, just as the Hussite Freedom Song was to the Hussites and to Robeson's character in the movie. The opening words to the song, freedom, freedom. Next, we'll be sharing with you a song from the Philippines, who in a similar bond with the Hussites removed themselves from the rule of Catholicism, albeit without a civil war, demanding a free and responsible search for truth and meaning on their islands, and they turned to universalism in the mid-20th century. This song, Maglepe Universalist, is another one of Dave's favorites that he asked me to play all the time. When translated to English, it asks us to be joyful universalists, another one of Reverend Dave's calls and wishes for us all that he taught with a loving heart.
Hello, it is my honor to speak with you today. I'm the Reverend Leslie Takahashi, and I'm so glad to be able to offer something in this service. Been thinking about the congregation so much, and of course about Diana and Erin and Ian and Greg, who Dave loved so much. I've been asked to say just a couple words about Dave's contributions to the association and to promoting universalism throughout Unitarian Universalism. The only way to do this in any kind of reasonable amount of time would be to talk about characteristics. Dave was a true believer. He believed in that universalist faith that was passed down to him for 4 generations, and he was proud to pass it down to his family. He believed particularly in the teachings that call on us to build heaven here on earth, particularly a heaven that embraces the worth and dignity of all. He believed in the primacy of the teachings about interdependence and our need to push ourselves to value all people. That true believer quality allowed him to do door knocking and as a young minister and to help start 2 congregations, which very few of us can say, and then to serve 5 more for a staggering total of 7, which would make any contemporary parish minister swoon just to think about it. And thanks to the collegiality of the Reverend Gene Pupke, he also could serve as such an active minister emeritus in Richmond. Dave was an activist with a special concern for racial justice, as we've heard throughout his career. And in the last years, this took the form of being an outspoken advocate for Black lives. In my last conversation with him a few weeks before his death, he told me that his work now was to try to make the residents of the place where he worked treat those Black staff members well. And I will not forget my last visit with him when he was wearing that famous large pin as we went out to lunch in Ashland, Virginia, and talking very loudly about the stupidity of people who did not understand how they should embrace all people. He was very passionate, and a few heads turned towards us during the course of that lunch. Dave was a truth teller. When I had the honor of editing his book, one of his legacies, Reclaiming Universalist Salvation, which I hope is still available, I told him jokingly that I thought my job actually was very simple. It was to keep him from libeling in print any person for whom he had a disagreement, and because that would endanger his retirement income. Dave told it like he saw it, and he was deeply morally offended by people who took a lackluster or non-committal view of our precious Unitarian Universalist ground without realizing how precious this real estate is. Dave was a scholar, and if he was here, he would jump up and protest that I use that word, because he was always conscious of his working class roots, and yet he used his considerable intellect to investigate more thoroughly than any person with much more academic training could do any of the areas about which he sought moral inquiry. And Dave was a teacher, and perhaps that will ultimately end up to be one of his greatest legacies. For all of those who came in contact with him, learned from him, especially those that were privileged to intern with him at some point. And some of us have given those lessons forward to the interns that we have had. And so he continues to perpetuate his theology. We have also used it in our national service. I've had the privilege of serving as part of the Commission on Institutional Change for the last 3 years. And when I got my first copy of that report, it never saw my shelf or my desk. I immediately put it in a padded envelope and mailed it to Dave, because I wanted so much for him to see that while I may not have done it perfectly, I tried my best to listen well. Dave will live on in all of us he taught, and in all the words and all the visions that he held for us. And I want to close also because he will live on in the writings that he left us. This is only one of those collections, and I'll read just a few lines. The hope of our lives is to find a purpose which shall give joy to our days and allow some part of us to remain with those who follow. Many, many parts of David MacPherson will remain with so many of us, and that is the kind of immortality he would want. Thank you.
Hello, I am the Reverend Walter Clark. And as Reverend Takahashi said, I was one of those few interns who had the joy and honor of serving in a congregation and interning in a congregation with Reverend Dave. Perhaps the most powerful thing he ever said to me was he charged me. He said, "You are the one who has to make this world a better place. Ours is a religion for the world that can save the world. And it's up for you to do that." And it's something that I am reminded of every time I wear this robe, of the duty to move this world forward to a better place because of that charge from Reverend Dave. I have been asked to read the Universalist Great Avowal of Faith, which was ratified in 1935 at the Universalist Assembly. The bond of fellowship in the Universalist Church shall be a common purpose to do the will of God as Jesus revealed it, and to cooperate in establishing the kingdom for which he lived and died. To that end, We avow our faith in God as eternal and all-conquering love, in the spiritual leadership of Jesus, in the supreme worth of every human personality, in the authority of truth known or to be known, and in the power of men and women of goodwill and sacrificial spirit to overcome all evil and progressively establish the kingdom of God. May it be so.
I am the Reverend McConna Morris, and I had the privilege of serving this Richmond congregation from 1978 to 1988, first as Director of Religious Education and then as Minister of Religious Education. And I had the very good fortune to serve with David MacPherson in his role as Senior Minister during those years. We worked together each day, each month, each year. I arrived straight out of graduate school with a master's degree in religious education. I was new to Unitarian Universalism, but it felt like home from the start. David was a wonderful mentor and teacher. He modeled what it meant to be a minister, what it meant to encourage and empower a congregation. From David, I learned how to welcome new members and help them find ways to deeply connect with their new church home. David knew that continuing to develop lay leadership was an important component to church health. Thus, almost every year, we offered a leadership development weekend to sustain our current leaders and to encourage new members to step into leadership roles. David deeply believed that a congregation always needs to be growing in its social justice work, and thus he helped found the Virginia UU Legislative Committee, with folks from all of the Virginia UU congregations who would lobby on state issues at the General Assembly each year. I watched with admiration Dave testify before many, many General Assembly committees. And David, with his Universalist upbringing, was totally committed to encouraging lifelong religious education. David and I taught many, many adult ed classes together, often creating the curriculum for ourselves. He was at the time moving from describing himself as an atheist to instead claiming the term religious humanist for his beliefs. I was a theist mystic. We offered our participants an understanding of the breadth of the UU theological spectrum, which we wanted for this congregation. I have so many, many cherished memories of working with Dave. One of my most favorite stories occurred way back in February, I think it was 1980. That was the year that our Intergenerational Activities Committee decided to have a multi-generational UU history-themed Mardi Gras parade. We borrowed 4 small red wagons for the floats, and David was tasked with writing up 4 UU history stories, important and dramatic stories. So Dave wrote up amazing brief stories about Olympia Brown demonstrating in front of the White House, Hosea Ballou arriving on the shores of New Jersey, Michael Servetus being burned at the stake, and Clara Barton helping the wounded on the battlefield. Action stories, history stories. Folks of all ages arrived on a Sunday afternoon and chose which story they wanted to work with. Each group had 45 minutes to create a red wagon float depicting their story with the wide variety of art and craft supplies we had provided. Such laughter and intense artistic endeavor followed. Dave had written the brief historic sketches in such a way as to truly capture the imagination of all ages. Since the day was rainy and cold, we could not go outside or walk around the block as we had planned, so instead we ended up walking back and forth the full length of the church. We even tossed gold-covered chocolate coins, just like real Mardi Gras, and we finished the event with a pancake supper. We had a reporter from the Richmond newspaper covering the event for some reason, and so it made the local news, and then it made the UU world. As always, David was there with his camera. Old-fashioned camera, not digital camera, not cell phone camera, taking lots of pictures, which he always got developed and posted on the bulletin board by the following Sunday. Dave knew that community is created by fun, fellowship, and pictures of us all together. I will always be grateful for David's teaching me about Unitarian Universalist roots and history, the breadth of our liberal theology, the importance of helping UUs live out their faith in social justice action, and the need to encourage lifelong learning and deepening in our UU lives. Thank you, David, for all you did for me and for our UU world. Blessings be.
Father's version of the Unitarian Universalist principles. He reorganized them in 1958 because he felt that our goal as a denomination needed to be first and forefront, and also that it needed to tell how we were going to achieve this goal. He hadn't actually added the eighth principle on, but he was absolutely thrilled that as a denomination, we were looking to include dismantling racism into our official Unitarian Universalist principles. We come here to affirm and promote the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, by witnessing for the worth and dignity of every person, compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement of spiritual growth, a free and responsible search for truth, the use of the democratic process, and the reverence for the interdependent web of life, which all are a part. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote, journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community, by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. May it be so.
If you paint me blue, cerulean September sky, there must be a yellow sun and something far and passing by, for I am made of all of this, a mother's love, a lover's kiss, my brother's pain, a dove fist, and more, and more, above the sparkle of the sea, render me that distant thing, over hues of blues and greens, a glint of gold on fleeting wings, for I am made of all of this, a mother's love, a lover's kiss, my sister's struggle to persist, and more, and more, more than the hand that moves the broad brush strokes of destiny, more than you can fill in the rest of me. frame me with translucent time, a moment like no other. Paint how you will this life of mine. A melody in colors, for I am made of all of this, a mother's love, a lover's kiss, my brother's pain, a dove, a fist, and more, and more.
The last time I spoke to my Uncle David was on the night of his birthday, September 23rd, 2 days before he died. We talked for an hour and a half, which was a bit of a longer than usual phone call for us. I sang him happy birthday all the way through, and during the conversation we laughed and we cried, which was pretty normal. At one point, he told me he was ready to die. I knew this already because he'd been saying it for years. We'd heard it before. This time, though, he told me how good he felt, knowing that we were all okay and in good places in our lives. Diana had a great job and was with Greg, who was a fantastic guy. Erin was flourishing in her career that she loved, and Ian was home from serving the country and had been using some of the tools he'd given him. These were some woodworking tools of my grandfather's, and it gave Uncle David a deep joy to know that Ian was cherishing these tools that had been in his father's hands and in his own. I am so grateful for everything I was given, where and when I grew up and with the family I had, he said. And if you ever talk to Uncle David, you've probably heard him say this too. He grew up on Charnwood Road in Somerville, Massachusetts, the youngest of the 3 MacPherson boys. They lived in a 2-family house that his Uncle Carlton had built. His father, Harold, was a master plumber who had served and gotten hit with mustard gas in France during the First World War. And his mother, Doris, was the one who held down the home. I'm sorry I never got to know them. Over the years, though, I heard stories from Uncle David, his oldest brother Robert, and my dad Wally. I am one of the few people now who can accurately report that the MacPherson household in the 1930s and 40s was clearly a raucous place to be. I heard all 3 of them tell the same jokes that their father told them. He was clearly a character. They had 2 cats, Pat and Mike, that they loved, but also seemed to need to tease by walking the cat around on 2 legs. They got their favorite dessert on their birthday, which for Uncle David was a maple frosted cake. My dad told me about antics that featured him and Uncle David, both pranksters at heart, ganging all their youthful energy up on Robert, who was the straight man of the group. They short-sheeted his bed, moved his things to lead him to believe he'd lost them, and made excessive noise when he was trying to study. And this lasted as long as they could get away with it, it seemed, which was usually about when their mother found out. And then the sound of her yelling, "Harold!" could be heard down the block. Interestingly enough, my grandfather seemed to have taken the side of Uncle David and my dad. They had their family dynamics set. Uncle David's childhood was pretty idyllic by his account. They had Sunday dinners with the family after church. They listened to the Lone Ranger, Fibber McGee and Molly, and The Shadow on the radio. They took trips to historic sites, and they visited the family in Falmouth, Mass, where they could all do target shooting. It was also a life that was centered around the West Somerville Universalist Church. Every summer they went to Ferry Beach, the Universalist camp in Maine. It's clear how much of his grounding came from those days and those people. I was lucky enough to know one of them. Alice Harrison, Reverend Dr. Alice Harrison, offered religious education for teenagers both at Ferry Beach and at her church in Lynn, Mass., where she was the first female RE director. I got to know her when I moved to Boston for grad school and started attending First and Second Church in Back Bay. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she actively encouraged Universalist youth to consider ministry. The day I met her, I was speaking to the minister, introducing myself, when she overheard me. And she came right up, interrupted us, and started excitingly telling me she knew my dad, she knew my uncles, she knew my grandparents, and she was so glad that my uncles had gone into ministry. His youth seems to have been one which was full of love and full of being held. He was held by family and held by the church community. And I think we can see how this translated into his life's work. In this last conversation, we talked, of course, about my late aunt, his beloved Dottie. They met in high school, and as Uncle David said, that was it. She was the one. I went to Richmond for a visit in the 1980s, and when I got back, I told my dad how amazingly affectionate they were, especially for a couple that had been together for so many years. And he told me that's how they've always been since the minute he met her. And so it was. Uncle David also told me a story about some nights when, after visiting Dottie, he had missed the last streetcar and had to walk home. I'd heard this from my dad too. I'm not sure about Uncle Robert, but I do know that for a fact that my dad and Uncle David on more than one occasion ended up walking miles just to get home after spending a night out late visiting their beloveds. But the detail I hadn't heard until September 23rd was that when entering the house, they sometimes discovered that their dad was asleep with the door to the bedroom open. And this was tricky because, as they well knew, their dad slept with a gun under his bed. Now, apparently they developed an art to, in limbo-style fashion, slink their way in past their parents' bedroom door. After graduating high school, he went to Tufts, that famous Universalist school, conveniently right up the road. Tufts led to Crane Theological School, which took him into his life in the ministry. When Uncle Robert died 2 years ago, in his eulogy, I recounted not having seen much of my uncles when I was a little kid, and how in my 20s, I decided to reach out. At the time, I was considering a career in ministry, since my lineage was as a MacPherson, literally son of a parson. It meant it was in my family's blood. And I decided I wanted to know these men as family. And from then on, I had very special bonds with both. And though I never got ordained, I feel as called as I ever was, and as engaged in ministry as I ever wanted. And much of this is because of the man we're saying goodbye to. I am who I am because of my family, all my people. He and I saw so much of the world the same way, and we spoke the same language. He just got me. When we last spoke, he told me he'd been thinking about sermons again and that he had 3 more sermons he wanted to write. After all those years in ministry, I finally know what I should be saying, he said. And I laughed at this, and I told him to write them, and that I would help him find a place to get him out in the world. When I've told people this story, they ask me if he told me what they were going to be about. He didn't. He didn't, but we can guess. Even if we don't know the words, we know what would have been behind them. Some people leave bigger holes than others. He leaves behind a chasm. Thank you for loving me, Uncle David. I promise I will keep up the work of putting love in the world and creating heaven on earth.
Peace be with you.
With you.
And also with me.
With me.
We lift our
We
hearts
lift our thanks and praise. For in peace we find love.
Love be with you.
With you.
And also with me.
With me.
We lift up our love.
We lift with thanks and praise. For with love we can seek justice. Justice be for all, the poor, the hungry, forgotten. We're one human family. For when all are seen as equal, heaven will build.
Peace be with you.
With you.
And also with me.
With me. Let us give each other a sign of peace.
Good afternoon. I'm Reverend Aya Simpson, one of those many interns of Dave's that we've heard so much about. 10 years ago, upon the occasion of David's 60th anniversary of ordination into the Universalist ministry, the Richmond congregation decided to send him on a pilgrimage to the places that made his ministry and his life. And they sent me along as sort of his gal Friday to drive him around and help see the places that he had loved. We had a good buddy cop journey together. He had a perfect memory of the map of Boston in his mind. Unfortunately, that map was last updated in approximately 1954. So he spent days arguing with my GPS system every time it told us to turn some way, being certain that he knew exactly where we were, and she was wrong. Why didn't she know that? I kept expecting her to talk back to him. He was so insistent that there was someone on the other end. We went to Salem, Massachusetts, and the Plymouth colony, I think just because he thought it would be fun. He showed me that house that he grew up in, that he walked to Dottie's from. We explored his life, got in a couple of minor scrapes. For half of the trip, he walked around with plastic wrap wrapped around a cut on his arm because he would not listen to me when I suggested that was perhaps not the best wound care. I was terrified to bring him back to Diana. We explored what it was to be a Universalist in the 50s and 60s. I saw the first congregation that he had ever served, the place he was a student minister, just as I was being a student minister with him. It was fun and funny and exasperating. It was a joy and a very odd situation. And I was enjoying my time on this historical journey. And then we got to Ferry Beach, and I realized that I had not understood my role correctly. I was not Reverend David's sidekick. I was his witness. At Ferry Beach, we walked into the room where he first spotted his beloved Dottie. He spoke of seeing her, of the event that was happening in the moment when he first saw her, and I swear it was like I was surrounded by a camp full of Universalists from 65 years ago. from the people and places who had made him and made his ministry. I was a witness to a life passionately lived and a love that most of us could not even imagine. I never got to meet Dottie, but I felt like I knew her, for she was the other half of Dave's soul, and he carried her around with him everywhere he went. I eventually returned him to his home, only slightly the worse for the wear, but I have carried that memory with me. I have carried the witness to a life lived with intention and a love that carried on for decades. It is my honor to be part of the witness of David's life and to carry it forward for new ministers and new congregations waiting to hear about universal love. It is an honor to be with all of you today, and thank you for letting me share.
Dave would be very proud of all of his interns. It's delightful to see them witness to the power of his ministry. So these three things are what I will remember about David Hicks MacPherson. These three tenets: discover your beliefs, live your beliefs passionately, and help others to discover their own. David worked hard to discern his own beliefs. We've heard about his childhood and his exposures, but I want to speak to one particular thing that I think really stayed in his entire life: the generation that bore and raised him. They were a group of people who took on the First World War and the Depression and built the mid-20th century powerhouse that was America, and did it without a need for any recognition or any fuss or bother. He admired those men and women so very much and found them all to be inspirational. And when things were clear to him about offered, he chose that was humble, no fuss, no drama, an occasional outburst of passion for sure, but to live simply and to not need all that the world was telling him he might. He admired the people who came before him and tried to emulate them. In David's time as a student minister, he was assigned to the Universalist home in Foxborough, Massachusetts. This is before Social Security. People lived in common homes according to their denomination. And he would go twice a week and sit with the members who lived in the home. He was thrilled to find out that some of them had been alive at the time of the Civil War. The historian David loved hearing their stories because they connected him to Universalism over time. These were people who knew the founders of the faith. For David, that was very important, as he chose ministry as his vocation and attended Tufts University. He went to Crane Theological within Tufts. And there was a great man by the name of Clarence Skinner, who was the dean of the school. Clarence was a historic figure. We've named a publishing company after him. And there's a sermon award recognizing his influence for all sermons that are given that are award-winning. They are about social justice. And David was one of the winners of the Clarence Skinner Sermon Award. The thing that made him proud about it is that he loved Dean Skinner and thought so much of him. Skinner was the one who said that universalism isn't going to be about eternal salvation. He was teaching that it would be about all the people in the world coming together in love to build that heaven here on earth that Reverend Walter read to us about before. He got to study with the man, and he admired him greatly. I had to mention Clarence Skinner in this eulogy. David also built up his own theology from many different sources. He was additive. History was a big component. Theology, or atheology, as he would point out. His own atheism, humanism, later on, as Reverend Morris told us. He collected as he went along, and probably one of the biggest influences in how he lived that theology was Dottie. His commitments to things like anti and feminism would not have been possible without her support. And when they met, they were figuring out together what it would mean for them to be universalists, for each of them to have a theology that they could stand by, and to live that theology in a way that was meaningful in their family, in the congregations that David would later serve, and also in the larger world, where David would call people to account regularly. The weddings and the dedications and all that were done by David in his time in ministry were a point of pride for him. There were so many Sunday sermons, and today we're actually using the pulpit from which David preached most of his time here. He would raise his fist to make a point and stick his finger, and it was never quite clear whether it was toward the congregation or toward the heavens. He would occasionally pound on the pulpit. Oh, not occasionally, fairly regularly, he would pound, because his passion would come alive in the moments of a sermon. What a great experience for our interns. Don't be milquetoast. Don't pretend that everything is fine. David was as close to Jeremiah as you can get under the umbrella of Unitarian Universalism. And wherever he would go, whether it was to a colleagues meeting, a chapter meeting, whether he'd come into a governance meeting of some sort here at the congregation, or simply to serve, to march, wherever he would go, he would bring that great passion with him. And it attracted people who saw that in unity and universalism, there were deep, deep convictions. I have great memories, as do almost all the ministers of Central, Eastern, and Western Virginia. They would be of Bucky McKeeman, Gordon McKeeman, David MacPherson, and Phyllis McKeeman sitting at the colleagues meeting. And David would always have on his tartan vest. They would share with us stories of days gone by and great, great figures of the past days. Never, I appreciated, forgetting the strong women who were religious educators, who nowadays would become oftentimes ministers. It was splendid to see how encouraging they were of all the ministers. But it was also a tough time for David, because Dottie became ill with dementia, a disease to which she would ultimately succumb in 2005. I never met Dorothy. I came here after she had died. And I, like others have mentioned, I felt like I knew her because she was so ever present and with David. So let me share with you just the personal, strong feelings I want to always remember about David. First, I want to speak of him as an emeritus minister. The title of emeritus minister should be a special one. It should reflect a significant ministry, one which had a positive and lasting effect on a congregation. And that is the case of why David was given the title emeritus minister by a vote of this congregation. But whatever he gave them during his time of service as their called and settled minister was only a portion of what they received. Because as their emeritus minister, he was downright amazing. He was at church every Sunday, and I mean like 50 Sundays a year, except for the times when he was preaching elsewhere, always in the front row. He was at Vespers, and he would spend his days riding his bicycle around Ashland 14 miles a day or gardening at his home. He dreamt up the idea of writing his book on He was a man with something to say and a belief that not saying it was in fact a great error. He spent time with all of our interns, not just Aya, who did take him on the longest trip probably of her life, but he really cared that they understood what power is in our faith. And he made sure to expose them to his understanding of Universalist theology. Dave believed deeply, and I'm immensely grateful that he was, in fact, my intern minister. When I first came to First UU in Richmond in 2006, I walked into my office. There were no books on the shelves, no hangings on the wall, nothing on the desk, except for a letter with my name written across it. I opened that letter, and it said to me, "Welcome to First UU. I am eager and confident that you are the right person for this role at this moment." He continued, "As an emeritus minister, I want you to know I will do whatever you need me to do. I will not do anything that you have not asked me to do, and I will support your ministry fully. If I ever have any doubts or concerns, you will be the first and only person I ever talk to about that. I wish you nothing but success in this ministry." And David kept every word of that covenant. We would ride together to colleagues' meetings, and we would discuss the changes in our faith, what he was seeing, what I was seeing. It was a very, very fine thing, and I made the mistake of sharing how wonderful it was with other ministers in the area, who promptly started taking David to the same meetings. Man. He supported me, he encouraged me, and when I particularly would have a difficult sermon to deliver or asking the congregation of something difficult, when I'd have to let go of a staff person who wasn't succeeding in their role, he would always tell me, "Keep going. You're doing the right things. You'll make mistakes sometimes, but you keep going because you must serve these people." And along the way, he would tell me stories of his own ministry and challenges. He would want me to tell you that if you know of any ministers in their emeritus who are having difficulties, you should clip that video out with our permission, David's and mine. I think it's important for us to say that if we all became a little more like David, it wouldn't be a bad thing. We're also polite and nice and too often conflict avoiding. But Dave would lay bare what was required of all of us. Discover your beliefs. Live your beliefs passionately. Help others learn to live their own. And because I can hear him in my mind, let me say the one thing he would not want you to leave without knowing. Our faith is in the power of all people of goodwill, of people who have a sacrificial spirit that will serve, and by serving, overcome all evil to establish heaven on this earth. This is a belief which we must own, taking into our minds and our hearts and letting it guide our every day. And in our efforts, we will draw upon the wisdom of sages and pilgrims who have learned what in this life is sacred and true, and how they have discovered what is shallow and crumbling in human folly. We must work to know what heaven must be, a place in which all people of all nations and races, of all creeds and gender identities are afforded love and community, a place of welcome, a place of dignity and freedom. And we seek these from a faith that is drawn from an all-pervasive love, a belief in the goodness beyond all knowing, and a goodness that asks us to commit to this faith and trust that ultimately good will follow. We must honor David, and we must not claim to be just like him, but to be our own selves, our true selves, but deeply informed by this marvelous man who had no like in all of our faith. Sometimes people would say to me, how is it being there with David MacPherson as your emeritus? They were hoping I might shovel a little dirt because they thought the man was so full of passion and opinion. How possibly could I thrive in such an environment? Well, actually, thrive we all did. He was grand, absolutely grand. And Dave would make me preach that you now and I now must go out there and live our faith and build heaven on earth. May it be so. May it be so.
I know it's often said that when a person dies, they're not truly gone because they live on in us. They live on in our memories. And because of that, we never lose them. We hold on to them. I will always have the memories of my sister and I playing as a kid out in Goochland, growing up in Ashland, going to visit my granddad, him coming to see us and support us in high school, in college, as my sister graduated, as I went into the Marine Corps, her first year teaching, whenever we'd come home and all be together on holidays. He was always so proud of us as his grandkids. And I'll never lose that. As long as I live, I'll have that memory of my granddad. But what makes me even happier is knowing that there are hundreds, thousands, probably, I think it's no small stretch to think tens of thousands of people who were affected by him, who also hold memories of him and his message that he spread through over 60 years of ministry of love, caring, justice, equality, his message of standing up for what you believe in, for helping those in need, and being the change that you wish to see in the world. None of these are original ideas or original concepts, and myself, like many others, heard that from so many other places than just him. But his actions truly spoke louder than words, and he lived those out every day. So as I move forward in life, and as we all move forward, it's beautiful for me to think that, yes, I have a happy memory of my grandpa, but he's not just living in my memories, he's living in my future as well. In my future, as I make decisions, as I attempt to be the change I wish to see in the world, knowing that he's still living on in my actions, in my future, and knowing that there's thousands, tens of thousands of people out there doing the same thing, that he lives on in them, is the happiest memory I could hope for.
I've really struggled with what to share with you all during my dad's memorial service. I wanted to show the whole person, not just the minister, not just the minister emeritus, but also the father and grandfather. So there are some pictures of my brothers when they were born, me, all of us as kids, my kids, Duncan's kids. I think my children did a fabulous job being in the car with my parents going around to all these historical places. I don't think my brothers and I were that excited about it, but my kids really enjoyed that. So I included some of those pictures. Many of them don't show my dad, but that's because he was there taking the pictures as well. And of course, my mom features prominently in there because they were absolutely inseparable from the time they met when they were 17 until my mom passed away in 2005. One of the legacies that I see going forward is my dad's passion about social justice work. So there are some pictures from the March on Washington. And there are things we don't have pictures for, like desegregating the playground in Maryland. The carousel that was at the Smithsonian for many, many years actually came from that playground. I just learned about that myself a few years ago. My dad was particularly pleased with being able to overcome some barriers and create the beginnings of friendships with some of the residents at Imperial Plaza who had vastly different views of politics and religion than he did. So that example that he set for us in how to create beloved community, that's what I want to hold on to from my dad's legacy. Thank you.
If you know Ian, you know that my brother loved our grandfather. If you knew my grandfather, you know that my grandfather could not have been prouder of Ian. Almost every time I saw my grandfather, he would say something about how proud he was of us. Additionally, my grandfather never missed an opportunity to support our education, whether it was attending various school functions for us or taking us to museums and historical sites. This love of education within our family played a huge part in my decision to become a teacher. My great-grandfathers were both in World War I, and Ian made the courageous decision to join the Marines in the fall of 2013. Ian followed in our great-grandfather's footsteps by being at Parris Island, South Carolina for boot camp and many trainings. For Christmas 2018, Ian presented his sergeant chevrons to our grandfather with this note. For Christmas 2019, I chose to preserve this note as well as many other family photos and memorabilia from our family history in a scrapbook. Ian's note said, "This is one of the sergeant chevrons I was promoted with. When we are promoted, it's tradition to be promoted with chevrons from someone older who was influential in your leadership or as a mentor. As you have always been that to me, I wanted you to have this one. I wish I could be here to see you open it, but I will be home soon. End of next month. Love always. Being decent. Sergeant MacPherson, Ian."
The relationship I had with Reverend Dave, was, I'm sure, as I stated, is common to so many people, because I felt like I had a special relationship with him, that there were things that we could talk about that I couldn't talk about with anyone. And I'm sure there are many people who could say the same thing, because his breadth of knowledge was just fantastic and remarkable. And his recall of it, even at 91, 92, his recall of all of that is just, it's remarkable. He was guided through all of that history. Born in 1928 to 2020, what an incredible span of life to be represented in the United States history. Born into the Depression, and then to see the rise to world dominance of the United States culture, and then to see it get where it is today. And I'm so sorry that he wasn't able to make it to vote in an election that he cared so deeply about. But he was guided by the UU principles through his entire life, and he gave his life to those principles in a different order, of course, because Dave was a different order. You know what I'm talking about. I imagine Dave smiling and chuckling, because I saw a lot of that when we talked. But Dave, we want to thank you for this remarkable life, this considered life across all those years. I want to thank you for leaving me with your incredible daughter. But we're feeling you. I can't believe I can't call you up and ask you, when did you learn about that? Or how did people think about this, etc., etc. You're taking so much knowledge with you. But we thank you for your life, and we are feeling you. And we will for the rest of ours.
I wanted to share a few more humorous remembrances of my dad with you all. Of course, you know, after I started recording, I started thinking of more things. For example, and I don't think there's any photographic evidence of this, which is probably a good thing. My dad loved building models, that we know, and we have lots of pictures of all of his models, many of which are carefully boxed up in the attic at the moment, waiting for new homes. But he also liked building model rockets and model boats especially. And he would build, I'm the youngest, so he would build models frequently with my older brothers. And then we would take them out to some sort of body of water and set them on fire. These are things you don't realize are very odd things until you start telling other people and look at their reactions. The one that I did know we got in a lot of trouble for with my mom, you know, we would frequently hear, don't tell your mother, don't tell your mother, if she wasn't with us on something. But there was one, and it must have been made of plastic or whatever. And for whatever reason, my dad and brothers decided it was going to be a good idea to float it in the bathtub of the house and set it on fire. That was a hot mess. I mean, the house smelled horribly and there's black smoke everywhere. I mean, it's incredible. We just had such a unique childhood. Along with his civil rights work, there was also, I'm sure, a lot of files on him for being a, you know, quote unquote troublemaker. So we all were raised with, you know, the notion that if you saw a dark sedan and men in suits getting out with cameras, that you get out of there. And to this day, I still don't like to have my picture taken, but we would see something that looked like a government car and we would all kind of slink into the background and disappear. And I remember learning how to answer the phone when my dad and an interfaith group were taking on the Undertakers Association of Virginia. They were trying to require them to have to give an itemized breakdown of costs prior to a funeral. And there were death threats. You know, when we answered the phone, we knew exactly how we needed to answer the phone and what to do if it was a threatening phone call. So, you know, as a teenager and a young adult, I'm chatting with friends about stuff and realized nobody else had these things happening. So those are some more of the more humorous remembrances. And there are tons more. I mean, who knew that you weren't supposed to climb on the tanks at Aberdeen Proving Ground? I remember distinctly sitting on the turret of a tank while my brother was inside turning the crank and having the turret move around. And then later on in life, discovering that, no, of course they didn't let kids climb all over the tanks. I guess my dad figured that was the best way to learn about them. But again, that was followed with, don't tell your mother.
Just as
Good afternoon. I am the Reverend Sherman Logan, and to go from first week here at First UU. He saw me and introduced himself as Reverend David. At that certain person, how he would later become such a significant person, and that means at the change pleasantries, but never really had a in-depth conversation. When Reverend tried to I was around Reverend, and after this ministry, UU Church, Dave, I was Reverend Sherman. And so when I was discerning about becoming a UU minister, I would often seek counsel from Reverend Dave. He always told me, if you can do anything to help, be sure to let him know. And he was true to his words. And as I started my journey to become a UU minister, Reverend Dave was always there for me. Whenever we saw each other, he would ask how things are going, offer words of encouragement and wise guidance. And I would never forget his unwavering support of my ministry from the beginning here at First UU until our last conversation that we had on his birthday. And I never doubted that Reverend Dave had faith in me. I knew he always had my back. We bonded during our many trips to our minister clusters meetings and the times I would visit him at his apartment in Imperial Plaza. I look forward to spending precious time with him and immensely enjoy our conversation. We would have lively discussions on Maria's topics. And of course, Reverend Dave would do most of the talking and I would listen attentively. I was in awe of his knowledge of Universalist history and his keen theological thoughts. We would talk about our families, politics, and our commitment to making Unitarian Universalism a welcoming and inclusive faith, and how we can improve race relations in this country.
Speak up, Sherman.
World fighting for social justice and civil. How was late in his life that he finally realized how much he benefited from his privilege as a white man. And he often shared with me how concerned he was for me as a Black man in this country and as a Black minister in our faith. And there were times when I thought about walking away from the faith. He always say to me, Reverend Sherman, Unitarian Universalist needs you. And I knew he didn't wear that big Black Lives Matter button on his lapel just to make a political statement. And I knew that my life as a Black man really meant something to him. So I often thought about what drew me to Reverend Dave and why did we bond so? Then I realized that if my father was still alive, we've been taking road trips together. We've been talking about our faith, fighting for our rights, the rights of marginalized members of our society, and how we can build heaven right here on earth. We will have discussion about politics, the states of race relations, and how the greatest commandment in the Bible that we ought to love each other. You see, my dad died over 30 years ago, and he didn't live to see me to become a minister. My dad was a strong man of faith. He had deep love for his family, a strong passion for life, and compassion for people. And I saw those same values in Reverend Dave. And while I know that my dad would have been proud of me, I also knew that Reverend Dave was just as proud of me as the minister that I've become. So Diana, Ian, Aaron, Greg, I love you all. And I know that the wonderful, special, heartwarming memories that you have of Reverend Dave, your devotion to him, and the love that you have of him will sustain you in the days to come as your family continue to deal with such a profound loss. Reverend Dave was so proud of you all, and I can hear the glee in his voice and sense his great love for his family whenever he'll talk about you all. Thank you so much for sharing your father and grandfather with me and welcome me into your family as your adopted brother. Reverend Dave's legacy and the impact he made on you online, everyone in this place had passed on and dominoes, and my love for him and my heart for the Dave. Rest in power, Reverend Dave.
I'm the Reverend Sue Cinnamon, and I want to thank you all for being here today. Thank everyone who so lovingly put together this service, our tech people, our musicians, all the guests that have spoken so lovingly of Reverend Dave, and all of you that have joined us today to celebrate Reverend Dave's life. We're deeply moved that you join us when we can't be together in person, but actually more of us can probably be together this way. So it's a way that we have honored the love he's left for us and our way of building heaven on earth. We invite you, if you'd like to give a donation to the endowment fund in Reverend Dave's name. A slide will be put up. You can do it by check or by the giving app. If it's by check, put Reverend Dave's name in the memo line. The giving app you give to the endowment fund. And finally, at the end of the service, after the closing hymn, we're going to gather together for a reception to celebrate Reverend Dave's life and our memories of them. I'll tell you, my first memory of Reverend Dave was probably 10 or 11 years ago. I was a guest preacher and I came in to preach. I didn't know him, I knew of him. And at the end of the service, he came up to me and he took my hand the way he does and said, "That was a great sermon. Not one I would have preached, but that was a great sermon." And from then on, we were wonderful friends. I will deeply miss him. So join us in the reception to share your memories of Reverend Dave, so that we can have an even deeper, fuller way of building heaven on earth.
Our benedictions are the words from the Reverend David Hicks MacPherson. In the days before we return to this meeting house, wherever we live, move, and have our being, whatever be the strains and stresses upon us, may we seek to be joy-filled testament to the good news that the world and all therein is one, that it shall be made whole, and that it will be the beginning. Amen. Blessed be Ashe.
Out of this big yes that is the life of David Hicks MacPherson, we now draw this service to a close and move to a time of celebration and reception where we're all going to talk and we're going to have a toast. So can I invite all of you to get a beverage of your choice? And in about 3 minutes, we're going to do a toast. We'll be showing a slideshow of David, which was shown before the service, after you go into break rooms. So we'll toast, break rooms, spend a few moments sharing stories. And then as you leave the breakout rooms, you can attend the slideshow and see some more photographs of David and his family. We're so grateful for everyone's presence here. So we'll just take a few minutes now, and then Duke Pearson will offer a toast to the Reverend David Hicks MacPherson. Duke, we're going to wait a moment or two for people
Right.
to get their beverages. Thank you.
Yeah, I know.
Duke, how did you meet David?
I met David through Diana, and she invited Darlene and I to come to brunch with them over at O'Toole's. And we went, and David and I ended up talking history the whole time I was there because he's a magnificent historian. And I enjoyed those Sundays so much, and have missed them so much since all this mess started. And now they probably won't come back. At least David won't be there, but he'll always be there when I'm there, as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I miss him a lot.
He's easy to miss. He would not have a small impact on people's lives. I just delighted today seeing all the former interns, not all of them, seeing many of the former interns of this church who really have the highest regard for him. I saw that some of them were watching the service from afar, and it's a great tribute to David.
I agree.
Mm-hmm.
I figure somewhere he's looking down on us from where he is going, y'all just keep the work up. Go ahead. You can do it.
He would definitely want us to keep the work up.
Yeah, and we will, in his name.
Yeah, we will. We have a lot of folks from different places. I've seen some places from North Carolina and from Wisconsin and from Maryland. And I hope some of the members of their former congregations have been there. So
It was wonderful to hear Leslie speak.
yeah, it is. It's great to see them all. So Duke, lead us in a toast for David Hicks MacPherson, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, a toast to Reverend David Hicks MacPherson, professional Bostonian, minister, historian, professional curmudgeon at times, and he will be missed by all of us all the way down the line. So here's to David. Drink up. He'd want
Huzzah.
you to. And thanks for the opportunity of doing this.
You're welcome. And if you have a few moments and can stay and listen to a story about David, tell a story about David, we'll also remind everyone that there is a place in the chat where you can link to and send a video or text. If you have something you want to share with others, that also is possible. You'll see an invitation to a breakout room come to you soon. And those will last 10, 15 minutes at the most. You're always free to leave sooner. We're grateful that you've been here and we're glad you came to the reception.
Everyone is welcome to stay in the center room. You should have a prompt at this point inviting you into a breakout room. No hurry to get there. It's going to be between 3 and 6 folks in every breakout.
I only have one picture. Look.
Yeah, I don't know why that isn't going ahead.
Bari, can you advance the slides?
Slideshow.